Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Break School Psychology. We are brewing up some fun together and just lean into all the coffee puns. You know, I love it. We have a great perk with us here today. We have Adena Young, who looks like does not have coffee, but I'll allow it.
Water break.
All right. She's going to hydrate. I'm going to dehydrate. And we're going to have a great time. I was so excited that you wanted to come on Coffee Break School Psychology to talk with us. For those of you who don't know Dr. Adena Young, she's a school psychologist and a math expert, math teacher, and she really does a fantastic job of helping folks understand why students struggle with math. So welcome, Adena. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's just jump right in. I know that I have a lot of school psychologists out there in my community and teachers and special educators who watch Coffee Break School Psychology. And, you know, I'm just going to be honest with you, as a school psychologist, I learned a lot about reading disabilities and how to support students with reading difficulties. And I, for whatever reason, did not get a ton of training on how to help kids with math disabilities. Is it just me?
It's definitely not you. I think that that's very common across the board, that in graduate school, there's a ton of training on reading and not a lot on math anywhere. Really, there's not, and that mirrors the research and just the knowledge base. I think in general, we as a society understand reading and reading challenges a lot better than math. I think a lot of the research hasn't been done. A lot of the conversations we're not having around math the way that we are around reading.
Well, let's have that conversation.
Yeah.
So I know, let's do that. We're going to talk about 3 ways to support struggling math students. And I, in my day, have worked with many a struggling math student. And I'll just, put it right out there that while I was able to get to graduate level statistics, there are some challenges with knowing math and then knowing how to explain the math. Like a lot of times when I'm trying to help students, I'm like, I know the answer, but I'm not quite sure how I got there. And
Right.
Sometimes I feel like Mr. Incredible. Have you seen that scene in Mr. Incredible where he's trying to help Dash with his math and Dash is like, no, they changed it. And he's like, you can't change math. Like
Right.
There's a lot of changes in the math curricula and the way we deliver it. So what I'm really interested in is, let's say you're a school psychologist or a parent or someone out there who has a student or child who's struggling with math. What's the first step?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's
Other
such a
than
common
tearing your hair out, being like, why did they change math? It's math.
Which so many people do. I get it. There's so many people who had their own math experiences, right? Growing up as students, and some of that is carried along, and just a lot of unease around how do I handle this new math that's happening, Common Core, integrated math, what have you. And I would say that it's really common for educators to want to directly go to, okay, what's the solution to this? What's the best way to teach a struggling math student? And so I think the first thing that I'd like to talk about is that there are a lot of different reasons why kids struggle. And before we can talk about teaching intervention or strategies, we need to talk about those reasons. Why is it that kids are struggling? And come up with a learning profile for each individual student to understand how their brains work and why they may be having difficulty learning math.
So I know that you've kind of done a really deep dive into some of the reasons why kids have challenges, and you've identified kind of the top 5, and everyone loves a good top 5 or top 10 list. Can you share maybe some of the reasons why students struggle with math?
Yes, and these are reasons that I have kind of come to see over the years of working individually with math students. Whenever I have a kid who is coming in with challenges, whether it's a math learning disability or ADHD or anxiety or just general learning problems, there's usually 1 or more of these 5 things going on. So the first one is calculation challenges. So when a kid has a difficult time quickly adding or subtracting, especially if their brain has difficulty remembering multiplication facts. Right? If time after time, by the time they're in 9th grade, they still can't do 3 times 4, something's going on in their brain as far as calculation, and that impacts their ability to do all kinds of more complicated math. So that's number one, is calculation. Number two is visual processing, their ability to look at a visual representation. And I should say everything in math is visual. I would challenge you to come up with one thing in math, any concept that doesn't have to do with seeing something and understanding what you're seeing, right? You're either picturing it in your head or you're looking at it on a piece of paper or on a slide or on a screen. So the second reason why students struggle is because their brains have a difficult time processing that visual information, whether it's perceiving it, breaking it apart, remembering it, or manipulating it.
I think I have that. I'm trying to help my sixth grader with her dividing fractions, which I know how to do, and I know the
Right.
algorithm. And then they're like, draw a tape diagram. I'm like, A, don't know what that is. B, that does not make sense for my brain.
Right. And so what you're talking about is exactly part of the challenge, is a lot of the strategies that we're teaching students to use are just more visual. So rather than making it easier for students, it makes it harder for them. Also, the basic algorithms themselves are also visual, right? And the way that kids come to learn them, even though hopefully, ideally, they're understanding what they're doing at the same time. But at the end of the day, right, you're thinking about flipping, right, the top and bottom of that fraction, right? And all of those problems, you're having to recognize that problem and be like, oh yeah, my brain sees, I have to flip that second fraction, right? And then multiply, which means across, bottom, I could go, stop me, I can go really far into the math of this, but that's a perfect example. And I think anytime your student is struggling, to look at the math and say, what's visual about this? If my brain couldn't process things the way that other kids could, what would I be seeing right now? Or what wouldn't I be seeing?
Great. So those are the first two. And
Yep.
we keep going. What are some more reasons?
Yeah. Number three is executive functioning. And I know that you do a lot of work talking generally about how to support with kids with executive functioning challenges. I talk specifically about ways that executive functioning impact like the nitty gritty of math, right? If you're doing a multi-step equation, right? You're having to organize your thinking. What's the first step? What's the second step? A kid with executive functioning is like, pew, I'm going to go straight to the answer, right? Difficulty organizing their math on paper, difficulty like pausing to even like come up with a plan, right? When we think about mathematical problem solving, the ideal first step is to analyze the problem and think about how we're going to solve it before we get in. Executive functioning challenges, right? No, they're just going to take one look at the problem, be like, oh, I know how to do that. And they're going to try to solve it.
Right. And they add instead of subtract and make careless errors and things like that, because they jump to, oh, I know this. This is familiar without that stop and think mechanism. That makes perfect sense to me.
Exactly right. And so there's a lot of different ways that occurs. And I think it's helpful for teachers to think about what are all of the ways that I'm expecting kids to regulate their thinking. What are all the ways that we need kids to have developmentally appropriate executive functioning in order to be able to follow my teaching, to solve these problems, right? To do their homework, all of those things. You've got smart kids, right? Who can do it if someone else is regulating them, right? When they're working with me, I'm doing a lot of that. I'm scaffolding that regulation for them so they could do it, right? But then they're on their own and all of a sudden they lose it.
Right. So it's a dance between like being their frontal lobe and lending your frontal lobe and then giving them opportunities to practice those skills. So I'm sure we could geek on executive functioning strategies all day long. That's my wheelhouse and things I love to geek out on. Let's go to another really common reason. And I also think I have this one. Go ahead.
Yeah. Anxiety.
Yes. Why is there so much math anxiety? People like see math and they freak out.
I mean, if we just like listen to the way that you've described math so far in this conversation, I think that explains it, right? Like math can be really hard. And if we don't get it and we don't know what we're doing, we can stress out about it. And so I think there's a couple of different types of anxiety that are creeping in, right? There can be anxiety as a reaction to not understanding. Right? Or you can come in with anxiety, right? If there's just more of a personality predisposition to having anxiety that then impacts your ability to do math. And then sometimes it goes in both directions, right? Where the anxiety then just feeds off each other, right? Oftentimes, anxiety can be a secondary symptom to calculation, visual challenging, executive functioning challenges, right? Because let's say you have a visual processing challenge, you look at this problem and your brain can't recognize it and you don't know what to do. What's going to happen, right? we're going to get anxious, and then we get frantic, right?
Mhm.
And we do what one of my students calls frantic math, where like all thinking and reasoning goes out the window and they just start throwing numbers at the problems, right? And I've had students come and talk to me after a test to be like, I totally knew it, and I got there on the test and I just panicked.
Right.
Right. And all of a sudden, I couldn't remember anything that I knew. And it's not that they didn't have it and they didn't understand it. It was that they lost access to it.
Right. They're in
Right.
brainstem instead of frontal lobe where reasoning occurs. This
Totally.
fight, flight, freeze moment.
Absolutely.
Sure.
The sympathetic nervous system is completely activated. Luckily, there are solutions, and this is probably going too far into it, but I've also got stories of how students have been able to then calm themselves down, right, in tests so that they're able to access, right? So there's absolutely ways of getting around it. But math anxiety is real. I think a lot of the times, whether it's parents or teachers, they're like, oh, you know, it's fine. We just need to tell them that they're good and they're okay at this, right? And it's more complicated than just telling a student to calm down, right? Or telling them you can do this, you can do this. Like,
yeah, and I can tell you as a mom that, you know, when they're struggling with math, or, you know, it's 10 o'clock and we still can't figure out the tape diagram, hypothetically speaking, you know, and you're all in both in brainstem, that to say like, oh, it's no big deal. It feels like a big deal.
Right.
Kids, when they have that emotional reaction to math,
absolutely.
it definitely does feel very real to them. So what is the fifth learning challenge that impacts?
The fifth challenge is cognitive overload. When the brain is being asked to do more tasks than it is able to accomplish. Like I often equate it to a cell phone battery with my students, right? You've got a limited amount of battery, and the more demands you put on it, the more that's going to go down, right? So if you look at it, any math problem, gosh, I wish we had more time. You know, I would take a problem and break down, okay, what are all of the cognitive demands in this problem for any neurotypical student? Right? We're asking them to pull out their prior knowledge, to think about what they know about the problem, to execute this algorithm, blah, blah, blah. There's all these things that kids are doing in their brains to solve a math problem or to learn math in general. If you throw on top of that added cognitive demand because there's calculation challenges. So in addition to that, they're going 3 times 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? Or if they're looking at this visual image and they're like really having to work to break down what this is doing, right? Or they're having to constantly move their attention back because of their executive functioning challenges, right? There's just too much going on. And so when there's too much demand placed on the brain, they just can't learn. They can't do math. Things that they understand, they can no longer do. And so, again, there's a lot of ways to kind of break this down, strategies to keep that cognitive demand kind of within the reasonable zone. I call it either the green or the yellow zone. We don't want them up in the red zone, so that they can actually learn and solve problems. If you're
forget about it, if it's a word problem on top of all that, then there's a linguistic demand too. So I'm beginning to understand some of these 5 learning challenges that kids might have. And I'm wondering, okay, from here, like, what is the solution? Like, what is the magic curriculum that is I can pull off of my shelf and deliver to all of my students?
Right. I would say that is probably the number one question that I get from educators. Adena, tell me what materials, I'm going to go and buy them. Tell me what training to take. I'm going to go and do I need Making Math Real, right? What manipulatives do I buy, right? What handouts, who on Teacher Pays Teachers, where, like, who's got this stuff, right? And the magic secret, I think, is that there is no one magic bullet. There is actually nothing to buy. All that you need, once you understand why kids are struggling, right? If they're having calculation challenges, they're having executive functioning. All you need is your brain, your understanding of math, and your understanding of your curriculum to come up with ways to teach that material to those specific kids.
It's more of a mindset shift, right? It's just like there's no one thing that would help a kid who has reading challenges. You really have to unpack like what's behind the music, what's going on for this kid, and then how can I tailor my intervention accordingly.
Absolutely. If we use your example of dividing fractions, right? different kids are going to struggle with that for different ways. So there's no one magic explanation for teaching how to divide fractions that all kids are going to understand, right? If this is the kid with calculation challenges, we're going to want to pull out a multiplication table because they're having problems with multiplication. If this is a kid with visual processing challenges, we're going to want to make that bigger, spread things out, and make sure that they see fractions are just a top number and a bottom number, and there's just two of them on the page. That's all we're dealing with.
Can I just give a shout out to my math teacher from 7th grade? I'm about to quote Mrs. Slatkin, if you're out there, thank you. I remember really as a student of math, I was good at math, but I also was like, I wanted to do it the right way. Like I wanted to figure out this is the way we do it. And then in math, teachers just love to give you 3 different ways to do it. And that really confused me. And so Miss Slatkin, I remember to this day, and I use this with my own daughter, like the best way to do math is the way that makes sense for you. And that really resonates with what you're saying, which is there's no one way to teach division. Maybe tape diagrams work like magic for some students and not for others. So it's really understanding the student. So that kind of leads us to our third point is, we're kind of thinking about practical ways to support students. And can you talk to me a little bit about, let's say, I've worked with a student and I have some hypotheses about what might be the challenge. What do I do next?
Yeah, I think it is giving yourself some time to almost, this might sound funny, almost to play with that student in math, right? Take some time to observe what's going on. If you have these hypotheses, pay attention and kind of test them out, right? If you have a kid and you're like, oh, I think there's a calculation challenge. What happens when you make the numbers super easy? Like change them all to 1s and 2s. If all of a sudden they can do it,
don't you call them friendly numbers?
Yes. That's what I call them, right? You take out all the negatives, you make everything positive, right? Some students, when the numbers are too big, they freak out, right? Which also triggers the anxiety, right? But if they don't know their multiplication facts, if everybody can add 1, right? By the time we're doing the math that we're talking about, like, oh, I can add 1, I can multiply by 2, right? And so if you make that change and it works, you're like, ooh, we're onto something. This is most likely a kid with calculation challenges. How can I go about and adjust things for them and support them? Right? And oftentimes it's almost like an RTI kind of model, right? Because if you make those small adjustments, it's not going to hurt them to do that, right? And then if it works, you're like, aha, let's just keep doing this. If that's solving their problem, we're good.
Yeah, it's like, it's a little baby experiments, like you're a math detective and you do a little experiment. Like what happens if I take this big giant visual of all the math problems and I have the student with executive functioning challenges highlight all the addition before they get started in a pink highlighter or something and really draw attention to that visual detail, or make it half, or make it one problem at a time with a window, and they do better. Well, then we have some, working knowledge of what it helps to get kids there. This is so juicy. We could geek out all day long. I know,
right?
But I just want to ask, where can people find more Adena Young? Because you have such wonderful strategies. Tell people your website. I'll put it in the show notes too.
Yeah. So my website is adenayoung.com. And I'm just about to post a training that I did this summer. It's called 4 Ways to Engage Your Struggling Math Students. It's a training where I go in and I actually teach you 4 different ideas kind of around some of the stuff that we're talking about today. And then I also have my new course with you.
Yes. And when she says with me, certainly I contributed in 0 ways to the mathematics behind this. But what Adena is referring to is we have the How to Reach Struggling Math Students masterclass at the Thriving Students Learning Portal, which is great because Adena will walk you through those top 5 challenges that she talked about. But then in addition, the special sauce that she brings is then there's 3 strategies within each of those. Am I correct? On how to actually address them if you hypothesize this is a challenge. So Adena's done the work for you, which is to help you understand the challenges, and then what do you do about them? So if you're a school psychologist out there, a special educator, or even a parent who wants to really understand how to support a struggling math student, go over to thrivingstudents.com. I will drop the link below. It's a fantastic masterclass. And as you might already know, just from listening to Adena, she makes it really easy to understand. And I might have to go back in there as a parent now who's doing pre-algebra again for the second time. It's a really wonderful course. And so go check that out. But thank you so much, Adena, for being on Coffee Chats.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like there's a math problem in here somewhere. If Rebecca drinks 72 glasses of coffee and half of it,
Girl, now that you're in middle school pre-algebra, we have to move on to unit conversions.
Oh no. Oh, there we go. We're triggering the math anxiety. Okay, I'm gonna go watch the course and I'll be just fine. But yes, let's figure a way to make math into a coffee problem, and then I can really grab onto it.
Got it.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank for all you for joining us on this episode of Coffee Break School Psychology. We'll see you next time.